The door of the house she had been born in closed with the flat final sound of an axe striking dead wood. On the other side stood her stepfather, a man whose grief for her mother had soured into a hard, bitter resentment. In Ilara's hand were 16 silver dollars, the clink of them a cold and lonely noise in the autumn air. In her other hand, a folded deed, the paper dry and brittle as a dead leaf. It gave her title to the old stone mill on Whisper Creek, a place the town of Providence considered less than worthless, a ruin, a hazard, a pile of rocks fit only for ghosts and rattlesnakes. At 18 years old, with her mother barely a month in the grave, she was an orphan, a landowner, and utterly destitute. Behind her, clinging to the rough-spun fabric of her skirt, were the twins. Samuel and Rose, all of 8 years old, with their mother's wide eyes and their father's quiet nature. They were her half-siblings, the reason her stepfather's resentment had finally boiled over. He saw their father in their faces, not his own, and could not bear it. They were now Ilara's to care for, her burden and her only purpose. She had what she wore, the $16, the useless deed, the twins, and a scruffy, loyal dog named Cinder, who now pressed against her leg, whining softly as if he understood the finality of that closing door. The town of Providence watched. They always watched. From behind lace curtains and through the shimmering glass of the mercantile, they saw the 3 children and their dog standing on the dusty road. Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, stepped out onto his porch, wiping his hands on his apron. He was a man built of pronouncements and certainty. He saw their meager bundle of belongings, the bewildered terror in the twins' eyes, and the grim set of Ilara's jaw. He approached not with charity, but with the heavy weight of his own wisdom. "A fool's errand, child," he said, his voice not unkind, but laden with the pity she already despised. "That mill is a death trap. The wind will strip the flesh from your bones before the first snow. Take your money, buy 3 tickets on the morning stage. Go east. There's nothing for you here now." He gestured with his thumb toward the vast, indifferent mountains that loomed over the valley. His advice was sensible. It was what any sane person would do. It was what the whole town expected. Ilara looked at Mr. Gable, then at the twins, whose small hands were now clenched tightly in hers. She felt the 16 silver dollars, each one a potential meal, a blanket, a mile of distance from this place. But she also felt the unyielding stone of her father's stubbornness in her own bones. He had been a stonemason, a man who believed in what was solid, what could endure. Fleeing felt like dissolving, like becoming mist. Building, however hopeless, felt like stone. She looked back at the merchant, her voice low but clear, carrying in the still air, "I'll need a good axe, a spade, and 50 pounds of salt." A flicker of disbelief, then amusement, crossed Mr. Gable's face. The town had its answer. The girl was a fool after all. He sold her the tools, taking 1/3 of her money. He watched as she bought a sack of flour, a side of bacon, and a small bag of beans with most of the rest. She turned her back on the stagecoach office, on the road that led east to civilization and safety. She squared her shoulders, gave a soft command to Cinder, and with a child's hand in each of hers, began the long walk west, toward the ruin on Whisper Creek. The town watched her go until she was just a small, defiant speck against the enormous coming winter. The journey was 5 miles, but it felt like 100. The road dwindled to a cart track, then a deer trail. The weight of the axe and spade bit into Ilara's shoulders. The sack of flour was a dead, unforgiving burden. The twins, brave at first, soon tired, their steps faltering. She carried Rose on her back for the last mile, Samuel clinging to her free hand, his face pale with exhaustion. Cinder scouted ahead, his presence a small comfort in the growing wilderness. The landscape grew harsher, the trees thinning out to reveal stark granite bluffs and fields of stone. The air grew colder as they neared the creek. the sound of its rushing water, a low, constant murmur, and then they saw it. The mill stood in a narrow valley, wedged between the creek and a sheer granite cliff face. It was worse than the stories. The great water wheel was a skeleton of rotting timbers, half submerged in the fast-moving water. The roof was a lattice of broken beams open to the sky, a gaping wound. The windows were empty eyes, dark and vacant. The thick stone walls, green with moss and black with weather stains, were the only part of the structure that seemed whole. It was not a building. It was the memory of one, a monument to failure. Ilara set Rose down, her own legs trembling with fatigue. She dropped the tools and the flour sack with a thud. The twins stared at the ruin, their hope, already so fragile, visibly crumbling. Rose began to cry, a thin, exhausted sound that the wind snatched away. Samuel just stared, his small face a mask of despair. For a single, crushing moment, Ilara believed the town was right. She heard Mr. Gable's voice in her head, a death trap. She felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air. This was not a shelter. It was a grave, waiting for 3 occupants. Her resolve, so firm in the face of the town's pity, now felt as brittle as the deed in her pocket. She sank to the ground, her body screaming with a weariness that went deeper than muscle. She had led them here to die. Cinder, sensing her despair, came and nudged his wet nose into her hand, whining softly. She looked at the dog, then at the crying children, and then back at the ruin. Her father's words came back to her, a memory from a day he'd been teaching her to read the grain of a stone. "Look past the surface," he had said. "The breaks and the stains don't tell the whole story. Feel for the heart of the rock. That's where the strength is." She stood up, forcing her body to obey. She walked toward the mill, her boots crunching on fallen slate. She put a hand on the north wall, the one pressed up against the granite bluff. The stone was cold, but it was a dry, solid cold. And it was still. The wind, which had been a constant whining presence on their journey, was strangely absent here. The massive cliff face acted as a shield, a windbreak forged by nature itself. The most brutal of the winter winds would tear over their heads, leaving them in a pocket of relative calm. It was the first secret. She moved inside, through a doorway that had no door. The interior was a cavern of debris and shadow. Rotting floorboards had collapsed into a dirt-packed cellar below. But the walls were magnificent. They were 4 feet thick at the base, built of massive, interlocking blocks of river granite, fitted together with a skill that made her father's daughter ache with respect. This was not a pile of rocks. This was a fortress. It had been breached by neglect, not by force. She knelt down, her hands sifting through the damp earth of the floor. Below the rot and leaf litter, the soil was dense clay, good for mortar, for chinking, for making bricks if she had to. Then she heard it. It was not the gurgle of the creek outside. It was a deeper, more constant sound, a vibration she could feel through the soles of her worn boots. It was the sound of running water, fast and deep, somewhere under the ice that was already beginning to form along the creek's edges. The main channel, protected by its depth and speed, did not freeze solid. A source of water all winter long. That was the second secret. The land wasn't worthless. It was waiting. Despair did not vanish, but it receded, replaced by a grim, aching resolve that felt as solid as the stone beneath her feet. This would not be their grave. This would be their home. The work began at dawn the next day. It was a battle fought with muscle and will against time and decay. Ilara's first task was to clear the inside of the mill. For days she hauled out splintered timbers, rotted sacks, and rusted iron machinery, piling it all outside. The twins, seeing her relentless motion, began to help in their small ways. They gathered fallen branches for firewood and hauled smaller stones in their arms, their faces smudged with dirt and determination. Cinder acted as a vigilant guard, his low growl warning away a curious coyote at dusk. The interior of the mill slowly transformed from a tomb of debris into a wide, open stone shell. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and cooking, were the first casualties. They blistered, broke, and bled. She tore strips from her spare petticoat to wrap them, wincing as the rough cloth scraped against the raw skin. Every swing of the axe sent a shock through her arms. Every stone she lifted felt like it was tearing her muscles from the bone. Exhaustion was a constant companion, a heavy cloak she could not shrug off. Some nights she was too tired to eat, falling into a sleep so deep it was like a small death, only to wake at dawn with her body screaming in protest. But with the pain came progress. She used the spade to level the earthen floor in one corner of the mill, packing it down until it was hard and even. This would be their living space. With the crowbar she'd found among the rusted machinery, she pried loose stones from a collapsed retaining wall outside and began the painstaking process of building the heart of their home, the fireplace. She remembered her father's lessons: a deep firebox, a high throat to draw the smoke, and a massive stone hearth to absorb and radiate heat. It took her 2 weeks of agonizing labor, her hands clumsy, her mortar of wet clay and sand often crumbling. But finally, it stood against the thickest interior wall, a monstrous, ugly, beautiful thing. The first fire was a sacred moment. She stacked the dry wood the twins had gathered, and with her precious flint and steel struck a spark into a nest of birch bark. It caught. A tiny flame flickered, then grew, licking at the kindling. Smoke billowed out into the room, and for a terrifying moment she thought she had failed, that she had built nothing but a smoke-filled tomb. Then, with a sudden whoosh, the draft caught in the new chimney. The smoke reversed its course, streaming upwards and out of a fissure in the rock she had cleared. The fire roared to life. Warmth, real warmth, pushed back the damp chill for the first time. The twins cheered, their small faces glowing in the firelight. Elara leaned against the stone, tears of relief and exhaustion tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. It worked. The next challenge was the roof. The main beams were mostly sound, great timbers of old-growth oak, but the planking between them was gone. Using fallen logs from the surrounding woods, Elara began the terrifying work of laying a new roof. She would spend hours with the axe, hewing a single log into a rough plank. Then came the Herculean task of getting it onto the roof. She built a ramp of earth and stone, and with ropes and levers, inch by agonizing inch, she would haul a plank into place. Twice she nearly fell. Her body was a symphony of aches, but the gaping hole above them shrank with each passing day. She covered the planks with layers of sod and thick clay, creating a living roof that would provide insulation against the coming cold. With the shelter taking shape, she turned to the other systems they would need to survive. She dug a deep pit in the cellar, lining it with flat stones, creating a root cellar to store what little they had. She used the salvageable timbers to build a small, three-sided enclosure against the fireplace wall for the animals she knew they would need. The stone of the fireplace would provide them with a small measure of warmth through the winter. For water, she cleared a path to the creek and found the deep channel she had heard. With a line and a bucket, they could draw fresh, clean water every day. By late October, the mill was sealed. She had filled the empty windows with carefully fitted stones and clay, leaving only small, defensible openings that could be plugged with wood. The door was a heavy planked thing she had built from the remains of the water wheel, reinforced with bands of rusted iron. Inside, their world had shrunk to a single, large room, dominated by the great stone fireplace. It was dark, cramped, and smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, but it was safe. It was theirs, but it was not enough. They needed a sustainable source of food. With the last of her money and a few dollars she earned by selling a cord of firewood to a passing trapper, she knew she had to return to Providence. The walk back to town was different. She was leaner, harder. Her hands were calloused and scarred. Her clothes were patched and stained. She was no longer the pitiable orphan. She was something wilder, something the town could not easily categorize. She walked into Gable's Mercantile, the bell over the door announcing her arrival. The handful of customers and Mr. Gable himself stopped and stared. She ignored them. "I need a milk cow," she said, her voice rough from disuse, "a young one, and 4 laying hens." Mr. Gable let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A cow? Child, what in God's name are you going to do with a cow in that stone coffin of yours? It'll be frozen solid by Christmas." The other men in the store chuckled. The nickname stung, but Elara's face remained a mask of stone. "I have the money," she said, laying the worn coins on the counter. He sold her the cow, a gentle Jersey named Daisy, and 4 nervous hens, convinced he was taking the last dollars from a madwoman. Leading a cow 5 miles back to the mill was another trial, but Daisy was placid, and the twins were so overjoyed at the sight of her that the journey felt lighter. They named the hens Hattie, Gertrude, Agnes, and Pearl. That night, for the first time, the mill felt truly alive. The soft lowing of the cow, the gentle clucking of the chickens in their warm corner, the crackle of the fire, the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping twins. These were the sounds of her new world. She had built not just a shelter, but a sanctuary. The town of Providence settled on a name for her endeavor. Mr. Gable, with his talent for a cutting phrase, had coined it, the Stone Folly. Sometimes the children would call her Cave Girl. The stories grew with each telling. She was living on roots and berries, half mad with solitude. She was building a tomb for herself and the children. Each story served to reinforce the town's collective wisdom. They had built their houses of wood with proper windows and porches on sensible plots of land. They had done things the right way. Her rejection of their path was an affront, and her presumed failure was a necessary lesson. A hunter named Brant, known for his arrogance and skill, made a point to ride out to the mill one afternoon. He found Elara splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of her axe echoing off the cliff face. He sat on his horse, looking down at her, a smirk playing on his lips. "Heard you were planning on wintering out here," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You'll be food for the wolves before the first deep snow. That pile of rocks will pull the heat right out of your bones." Elara didn't stop her work. She set another log on the block, raised the axe, and brought it down with a clean, satisfying crack. She looked up at him, her face impassive. "The stone holds the heat if you give it enough to hold," she said quietly. "And the wolves don't bother us." Brant just laughed, shook his head, and rode off. The story of his visit adding another layer to the legend of the foolish girl at the Stone Folly. As autumn bled into winter, life at the mill settled into a deep and unwavering routine. The world outside their thick stone walls shrank and grew hostile, but inside they had created a pocket of order and warmth. Each day was a cycle of essential tasks, a liturgy of survival. Elara would rise before dawn, the air in the mill cold but not biting. Her first task was always the fire. She would rake the glowing embers from the bed of ashes, add kindling, and gently blow them back to life. The fire was the heart of their world. It could never be allowed to die. While the fire grew, she would milk Daisy. The cow's warm flank and the rhythmic hiss of milk into the pail were a comforting start to the day. The milk was everything, for drinking, for making butter and simple cheese. The twins would wake to the smell of porridge cooking and the warmth spreading from the massive hearth. After they ate, their days were filled with chores that felt like rituals. They fed the hens and collected the precious eggs, each one a small miracle. They helped Elara haul water from the creek, a task that grew harder as the ice thickened. They carded wool from a fleece Ilara had traded for, learning to spin it into rough yarn on a drop spindle she had carved. Her world was the fire, the animals, the children. The steady rhythm of her axe as she cut and split the enormous pile of firewood she had amassed. The quiet evening spent mending their clothes by the firelight, telling the twins stories her own father had told her. She was utterly alone, yet she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of this small, warm kingdom of stone and firelight. The mockery of the town, the memory of her stepfather's cruelty, it all seemed to belong to another world, a world that existed outside her thick, silent walls. The first test of her fortress came in early December, not a blizzard, but a pack of timber wolves driven down from the high country by hunger. They came in the dead of night, their howls echoing in the narrow valley, a sound designed to freeze the blood. The twins awoke, terrified, and scrambled to Ilara's side. Cinder stood at the heavy plank door, the fur on his back raised, a low, rumbling growl in his chest. The wolves circled the mill, their shadowy forms flitting past the small plugged window openings. They scratched and clawed at the door, smelling the cow within. In a wooden house the sound would have been terrifying, the thin walls seeming to vibrate with their menace. But here the stone absorbed the sound. The scratches were faint, distant. The walls were 4 feet thick. The wolves were an annoyance, not a threat. Ilara calmed the twins, stoked the fire, and sat with her back against the warm hearth, the axe resting by her side. She listened as the wolves eventually gave up, their howls fading as they moved on in search of easier prey. Her shelter had held. The stone was not a coffin. It was armor. The first blizzard arrived just after the new year. It did not come gently. It descended upon the valley like a hammer, a sudden violent assault of wind and snow. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, turned to a churning gray wall that swallowed the mountains whole. The wind screamed through the bare trees, a physical force that clawed at the world. It was a storm far worse than anyone in Providence had prepared for. Inside the mill the change was dramatic but not terrifying. The howling of the wind was a deep, muted roar outside their walls. The fine, powdery snow, driven by the gale, forced its way through minuscule cracks in her stone and clay chinking, but it was not enough to cause a draft. Ilara simply mixed a fresh batch of clay and plugged the tiny gaps. The fire in the great stone hearth burned steadily, its heat radiating outwards, absorbed by the tons of granite that surrounded them. The stones, which had been drinking in the heat for weeks, now gave it back slowly, creating a stable, persistent warmth that the storm outside could not touch. They were not fighting the storm. They were living within a mountain that ignored it. In Providence, it was a different story. The town's confidence was the first casualty. The houses, built of sawed lumber, groaned and shuddered under the wind's assault. Shingles were torn from roofs like dead leaves. The fine snow, like dust, was driven through every crack, every seam, piling up in ghostly drifts inside parlors and kitchens. Fireplaces, built for cheer more than for survival, devoured firewood at an alarming rate. The cold was a living thing, an intruder that could not be kept out. The first blizzard lasted for 3 days. When it finally broke, the town was battered but intact. They replenished their wood piles, patched their roofs, and told themselves it was the worst storm in a decade, a once-in-a-lifetime event. They were wrong. A week later, the second blizzard hit, fiercer than the first, then a third and a fourth. Winter had locked its jaws on the mountains and refused to let go. By the time the fifth blizzard descended, the town was breaking. Roofs, heavy with accumulated snow and ice, began to collapse. The roof of the meeting hall cracked down the middle with a sound like a gunshot. The town's collective wood piles, which had seemed so large in the autumn, were now dwindling to nothing. Families began to huddle together in the few houses that were still sound, pooling their resources, their fear a palpable thing. Livestock kept in wooden barns that offered little protection from the deep, penetrating cold began to die. The town's carefully constructed systems, their sensible way of life, were failing. Their world was collapsing under a relentless siege of white. Inside the stone folly, life continued its steady rhythm. The blizzards were mere inconveniences. The firewood pile, which Ilara had built to a monumental size, seemed barely diminished. The cow was warm, the chickens were laying, the root cellar was still stocked with potatoes and salted meat. The contrast was absolute. Outside, a world of chaos and freezing death. Inside, a small, ordered universe of warmth and life. Ilara and the twins were no longer just surviving. They were prevailing. It was during the sixth blizzard, the most brutal of them all, that a desperate banging came at their door. It was a sound so alien in their isolated world that it startled them all. Cinder erupted into a frenzy of barking, pressing himself against the heavy planks. Ilara grabbed the axe, her heart pounding. She motioned for the twins to hide behind a stack of firewood. She slid the heavy wooden bar from the door and cracked it open just enough to see. A figure, completely encrusted in snow and ice, stood there, swaying on his feet. He was not a threat. He was a wraith. He collapsed forward as she opened the door, falling into the room in a heap. Ilara dragged him inside and slammed the door against the screaming wind. As she brushed the snow from his face, her breath caught in her throat. It was Thomas, Mr. Gable's eldest son, a boy of 17 who had always been among those who laughed the loudest at the stories about her. His face was white with frostbite, his lips blue. He was barely conscious, his words a desperate, frozen whisper. Wood. We have no more wood. My sister, she's sick, the fever. She's so cold. He looked around the room, his eyes wide with disbelief, taking in the scene, the roaring fire, the warm, dry air, the cow placidly chewing her cud, the smell of baking bread from a Dutch oven nestled in the coals. This was not the dark, freezing tomb he had imagined. This was life. Here was the choice. The man whose family had led the chorus of her mockery, who had named her home a folly and her efforts a fool's errand, was now at her mercy. Her firewood was precious, the product of hundreds of hours of back-breaking labor. It was her family's lifeblood, their guarantee of survival through this endless winter. Every log she gave away was a risk, a piece of her own security chipped away. The memory of their scorn was a bitter taste in her mouth. But then she looked at the twins, their faces peeking out from behind the woodpile, safe and warm. And she looked at the desperate, freezing boy on her floor. She saw not the son of her mocker, but a brother trying to save his sister. Her father had taught her to build with stone, but her mother had taught her that mercy was the mortar that held a soul together. The choice was not a choice at all. She gave Thomas a cup of hot broth and sat him by the fire. Then she put on her heavy cloak and went outside into the maelstrom. She loaded a small, sturdy sled she had built with as much split oak as it could carry. It was a harrowing journey back to the town, a blind fight through the blizzard's teeth, with Cinder guiding the way, his barks lost in the wind's roar. She did not go all the way to Gable's door. She left the sled at the edge of the town, where Thomas had told her he had collapsed, and then she turned back, a ghost disappearing back into the white chaos from which she had come. She had risked her life for people who had considered her a joke. The wood saved Thomas's sister, and his story, when he was well enough to tell it, shattered the town's perception of Ilara forever. He spoke of the impossible warmth, the lowing of a healthy cow, the sight of chickens scratching in a warm corner, the organized stacks of food and firewood. He described a fortress of life in the midst of a dying world. It was not a folly, it was a miracle. When the sixth blizzard finally broke, a small procession made its way from the town to the mill. At its head was Mr. Gable, his face etched with shame and desperation. His wife and sick daughter were with him, bundled in every blanket they owned. He stood before Ilara's door, not with pronouncements, but with the broken humility of a man who has been proven utterly wrong. "We were wrong," he said, his voice cracking. "We called you a fool. My God, we were the fools. We need help. There are others, families with nothing left." Ilara looked at him, at his shivering wife, at the pale face of his little girl. She saw no triumph in his defeat, only suffering. She felt no satisfaction, only a deep, quiet ache for their hardship. Her response was not words, but action. She simply opened her door wide. "There is food," she said. "Come by the fire." They entered her home, their eyes wide with the same shock his son had felt. They stared at the massive stone walls, radiating a gentle, enveloping heat. They saw the calm order of her systems, the water barrel, the food stores, the animal pen. They felt the warmth hit their frozen faces, and it was like a physical blow. Mr. Gable looked at the fireplace, at the twins who watched him with solemn eyes, at the woman, the girl, who had built all of this with her own 2 hands. He began to weep, quiet, racking sobs of a man whose entire world of certainty had been dismantled. Ilara simply handed him a bowl of hot stew. She offered a seat to his wife. Her grace was as solid and unyielding as the stone walls around them. She did not boast. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply provided. Over the next weeks, as the 7th and final blizzard raged, the mill became a refuge. Ilara took in 2 other families, their children huddled together with Samuel and Rose. Her stores were stretched thin, but they held. The stone folly became an ark, a pocket of survival in a frozen sea. She taught the men how to bank a fire to conserve wood, how to read the weather in the clouds. She showed the women how to make cheese, how to render tallow for candles, how to use every last scrap of food. She shared not just her resources, but her knowledge. When spring finally came and the great thaw began, the town of Providence was changed forever. It had been humbled, stripped down to its foundations. The people who emerged from that long winter were different, quieter, more respectful of the mountains and the weather, and filled with a profound, unshakable respect for the young woman they had once scorned. The name Stone Folly was never spoken again. Instead, they began to call it the Hearthstone, for it had been the warm heart that had kept the community from freezing to death. The immediate aftermath was a transformation. People no longer came to mock, but to learn. Men who had built their flimsy wooden houses now came to Ilara to ask questions about stonework, about insulation, about siting a home to work with the land instead of against it. She would walk with them, pointing out how a bluff could break the wind, how the southern sun could be used for warmth, how a foundation of stone could store the heat of a fire. Mr. Gable became her staunchest advocate, his mercantile now stocking the tools for building with stone, his stories always beginning with the words, "I was a fool, and she saved us." Her methods began to spread. The next homes built in Providence were different. They were dug into hillsides with thick stone walls and sod roofs. Fireplaces were built not for decoration, but for massive thermal storage. The town began to rebuild itself around the principles of resilience and endurance that Ilara had demonstrated. Her story was carried by trappers and travelers to other settlements in the mountains, a cautionary tale about arrogance and a lesson in the quiet wisdom of working with nature. The landscape of the valley itself began to change, reflecting what they had learned from her. The Hearthstone was no longer just a home. It became a landmark, a testament to what one person could build when left with nothing but courage and her own 2 hands. Years passed. The twins grew up strong and capable, their childhood of hardship forging them into adults who understood the value of hard work and the importance of community. Ilara never left the mill. It was more than a house. It was a part of her. She expanded it, adding a greenhouse that used the thermal mass of the cliff face to grow vegetables year-round. She became the quiet, respected heart of the town she had once been cast out of. Her life was not one of wealth or status, but of deep, resonant peace. She had built not just a shelter, but a life, a legacy of quiet strength that would endure long after she was gone. Sometimes, in the quiet of a summer evening, she would sit on the stone bench outside her door, cinders descendant at her feet, and watch the sun set behind the mountains. She looked at the solid walls of her home, the product of her own pain and persistence, and felt no bitterness for the injustice that had sent her there. She had been given a pile of rocks and had built a foundation for a future. The world had tried to break her, but it had only succeeded in showing her what she was made of. She was like the stone itself, weathered, scarred, but impossible to break, her strength found not on the surface, but deep in her core.